Loud and clear.
From the studios of Radio Sputnik in downtown Washington, D.C., it's loud and clear. We take you inside the news 5 days a week. It's happening, and it's happening now. I'm Brian Becker. Donald Trump held a major press conference yesterday, just a week before he takes office, and just a day after unverified claims circulated in the mainstream media and other media that Russia had damaging information about Donald Trump. Extraordinary press conference, extraordinary news. We're going to be talking about it in the full hour. We're joined by former CIA analyst and political activist Ray McGovern, and from New York by editorial cartoonist and columnist Ted Rall. Welcome, Ray and Ted.
Thank you.
Hi.
Okay, Ray McGovern, let's start with you. That press conference was pretty extraordinary yesterday. It came just a day after CNN first reported in a more oblique way, but then BuzzFeed in a more specific way about a dossier supposedly compiled by a former British intelligence agent that the CIA and FBI and other intelligence chiefs met with Obama and discussed with President Obama and with President-elect Donald Trump in private in intelligence classified briefings that was then released, first alluded to, as I mentioned, by CNN, and then very quickly thereafter reported in full. The dossier, so-called dossier, was published by BuzzFeed, and it alleged that Donald Trump had committed acts in Russia that would compromise him, and that the Russian government had this intelligence, and that the Russian government was working with Trump operatives, including a lawyer, Michael Cohen. In other words, it was a big scandal, and that's what blew up at the press conference. Ray McGovern, what was your impression? How did Trump handle it?
Well, he was clearly very angry. I talked about outrage a couple of times and even talked about sick people. He said, what kind of sick people put this crap together? Now, I mean, I can understand how he feels about that. I mean, the CIA does this all the time. One of my colleagues, Phil Giraldi, commented this morning, we used to do that in Western Europe all the time. We put this kind of stuff together and put it out. None of it's true, but it works. Okay, so what you mentioned before, Brian, that this was released. Well, it wasn't released. It was leaked. And that's what's got Trump so angry. There are only a couple of people that could have released it
Who could have leaked it? I mean, it had to be the intelligence agencies themselves. Donald Trump said no one else was in the meeting. He said he cleared his aides from the meeting. In other words, if he met with James Clapper and Comey, the director of other intelligence agencies, and they were the one who brought this two-page annex to him, weren't they the ones who had to leak it? And that raises the question, if in fact that was what happened, that they leaked it to CNN and then to BuzzFeed, was there an attempt by U.S. intelligence agencies that Donald Trump has been ridiculing because of their allegations about a Russia hack? Is it possible that the CIA was trying to overthrow, or other intelligence agencies trying to overthrow Donald Trump before he became president?
Well, overthrow is too strong, but just by a hair. Look back a couple of weeks. They tried to derail the Electoral Commission, the Electoral College. That didn't work. Obama wouldn't quite go along that far. Now they're trying to defame him. Now they're trying to say he's a Putin puppet. And, it's all based on what we used to call, the swag factor, a scientific wild guess here, When Trump says, who puts this kind of crap together, he's quite right in saying that. Who's doing this? Well, the way I reconstruct it, it's John Brennan, who's been pretty much running things in Washington for the past 8 years. I say that again. John Brennan, the head of the CIA, and before that, a national security advisor to Obama for counterterrorism, has been pretty much running at least foreign policy type things in this town for 8 years plus. Now, what was my first clue? My first clue came right after John Brennan joined the Obama campaign in June 2008. What happened the first day of July? Obama says, I said I was against that legislation that would hold the NSA and the giant telecoms harmless for gross violations of the Fourth Amendment to our Constitution. But I changed my mind now. I think we ought to hold them harmless. Well, that made me sit up and write right away, whoops, count this guy out. Count me out in terms of supporting a guy like Obama who's going to change his mind on something this critically important even before he becomes president. So John Brennan's been in there since June of 2008. Why do I say all that? Because John Brennan now is losing his main patron, his main protector. And, we have an expression in this town about being thrown under the bus. Well, Obama's not going to do anything to protect John Brennan from being thrown under the bus. He is obviously guilty of rather heinous things, including kidnapping. They call it extraordinary rendition, of course, for torture and other things. Now, he's liable for prosecution. So what does he do? Well, he spreads all this dirt around about Trump so that when Trump or if Trump and his people go after Brennan can say, oh, yeah, they're just retaliating against me for all that true information that I served up. And of course, I can't tell you the sources and the methods because they're all classified. But yeah, it's the whole thing. It's really, really quite an amazing development.
Ray, let me bring in Ted Rall. Ted Rall, Ray is suggesting that John Brennan has an axe to grind, meaning he wants to protect himself, that the intelligence operatives, the leadership like Brennan, are after Trump for very, very personal reasons. In other words, to avoid their own sort of being held account for wrongdoing. I want to talk about the big picture here, Ted, because there's obviously immense instability during the transition between the outgoing president and the incoming president-elect. Matter of fact, more instability than has been witnessed in a long, long time. And for people who are used to having stability, they might not remember that this is actually another part of American politics. In 1963, the President of the United States was assassinated. That had a big impact on the 1964 election. In 1968, Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, was also assassinated after it was clear that he was winning the Democratic nomination following his victory in the California primary in June 1968. Then you had the assassination attempt on George Wallace in the 1972 election. And then the 1972 election ended with Richard Nixon winning, but he was forced to resign from office after an FBI operative functioning as Deep Throat gave incriminating information to Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein from the Washington Post. In other words, the 60s and early 70s were a period of instability, assassinations and purges and resignations and near impeachments. So in some ways, it looks like the United States is going back to a period of intense instability within the very summits of the American political establishment. Do you see it this way?
Well, yes, I do. I would probably also append to your list of borked presidential elections, the 2000 Florida recount debacle and the stepping in of the Supreme Court in order to settle a case that they didn't even have any business under the U.S. Constitution hearing in the first place. But that said, another interesting parallel here is the fact that the CIA was significantly weakened, and so was the intelligence hierarchy in general after Watergate and those events. It was probably at its low point in terms of power, prestige, and funding under the Jimmy Carter administration, and things started to pick up again beginning with Reagan and have just accelerated ever since. So it seems like the instability of the political system is almost directly related to the power of the intelligence community and the 17 agencies, many of them with overlapping responsibilities, that are running the show behind the scenes, as it were. So, yeah, I do think that the powers that be, particularly business people on Wall Street, and I used to work. I worked on Wall Street during the 80s and early 90s. I remember that the one thing that we always looked for was the ability to project out the future financials. You want business people like to know what's coming. They like to know what tax policy is going to look like. They like to know what tax rates and all those kind of barometers, consumer confidence. They like everything to be steady and improving. And with Donald Trump, the guy's a wild card. And there's a split in the ruling classes between those who view him as a welcome breath of fresh air who might improve profits for large corporations, and those who view him as an existential threat to the stability that they feel that markets need, and require in order to thrive.
Let me ask you, Ted, does that mean, in your opinion, that there is an effort to essentially stop Trump from ascending to the White House through these means by the intelligence community for whatever reasons, either for personal, factional, or other reasons? Is there a way underway in the United States to upset the ascension of Trump to the White House? And Trump, for his part, at the press conference, he denounced CNN as fake news. He said BuzzFeed, which printed the full dossier of this unverified report about his perverted actions in Russia, purportedly, things that he says are absolutely untrue. He called BuzzFeed a pile of garbage. And then he asserted that the intelligence community, the intelligence organizations, these are the organizations he's going to be heading up in 1 week, that he compared to them to, and what they've done, to something that would have been done by Nazi Germany. He said, I think it's a disgrace, and I say that, and I say that, and as something that Nazi Germany would have done, and they do, meaning, in other words, insisting that the intelligence communities are acting like Nazis. I mean, not the intelligence community, CIA, NSA, these organizations. There's not really a community, perhaps. Maybe, Ray, you'll disagree with me about a community. But these organizations are acting like Nazis. I mean, that's unlike anything I've heard from an incoming president talking about the CIA. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, certainly it's plausible to speculate that explains what's going on. Look, there's two ways to look at this. Either this is a conspiracy to prevent Donald Trump from becoming president on January 20th, or from making sure that he doesn't last very long after the 20th, or it's just an innocent quest for the truth to find out what Russian interference, if any, took place in the presidential election.
Wait a second. When your second possibility is, I'm actually laughing inside. You meant that as a joke, right?
Well, those are the ways. The
innocent quest.
Yeah, the innocent quest. You can interpret it as one of those two things. I think you know where I stand on this. It's obviously, look, the Russian hacking story has had literally from the start absolutely no evidence, forget about proof, no evidence even presented, to the extent that this should not have even been reported by a high school newspaper. It's the kind of thing that if you brought to most editors, they would just say, well, interesting stuff, go out and source it with two people and we'll talk about it again. So there's no there. But that's how, the only way you can interpret it is like, this effort against Trump is either an attempt to do him in or not. And like what one moment that I noticed leapt out at me, and I'm not sure other people paid much attention to in yesterday's news conference, was the BBC journalist who asked outright if there was any truth to these reports, particularly about what supposedly took place at the Ritz-Carlton in Moscow. Then would he stand down? In other words, would he not assume the presidency, or would he resign after he became president? And Trump didn't answer that question directly.
Well, he did. I think Trump said there's nothing to that. He said it's not true.
Right. He said it's not true, but it's not really an answer to the question. But
okay, but I thought he was saying it's not true. Anyway, Ray McGovern, let's go one other option, one other variable here. Is this an effort, if it's not to stop Trump from ascending to the White House, is it a way to change the nature, the political orientation of the incoming Trump administration, so that he steps back from and away from the idea that there should be a reset or an improvement in relations with Russia? Because that seems to me to be the other thing. The intelligence communities that are at war, not community institutions that are at war with Russia under the Obama administration, are basically saying to Trump, give up this idea that there's going to be real friendly relations between the U.S. and Russia, or we're at war with you. In other words, cornering Trump, trying to get him to renounce this position. And Trump at the press conference said, yes, I believe that Russia was engaged in the hack. And that was after CNN was trying to cover up for its own lying, whatever, fake news. That's what CNN emphasized was Trump said, yes, Russia did hack.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Right. Russia did hack. Oh, surprise, surprise. Everybody hacks. The Chinese hacked and got 20 million records of my own background investigations, everybody else. Now, the question is not whether Russia hacks. The question is whether the Democratic National Committee emails and those of John Podesta were gotten by the Russians and given to WikiLeaks, and there is zero evidence of that. One of the reasons that Donald Trump has adequate cause to be down on CNN is this. Here is the chief international correspondent. Her name is Amanpour, and she's asking a Russian in Moscow, quote, let me ask you, Trump and his team is saying there is zero evidence on Russian hacking, but do you think that even Moscow people believe that the Obama administration would have slapped sanctions on Russia, and 17 other intelligence agencies believe that there is evidence? How can you say there is no evidence if there are sanctions? Well, I remember being asked before the war in Iraq, or actually after the war started, McGovern, how can you say there's zero evidence on weapons of mass destruction when Bush and Cheney have started a war on Iraq? Well, it's fairly easy because they lie a lot. That's how.
That's Ray McGovern. We're talking to Ray McGovern and Ted Rall about the Donald Trump press conference yesterday and about the allegations that surfaced, unverified allegations, obviously leaked by intelligence leadership to the media, that the media then, or some of the media then, published, maybe trying to bring down Trump before Trump ascends to the White House. We want to know why. You are listening to Loud and Clear. We'll be back.
Loud and Clear. Loud and Clear.
You are listening to Loud and Clear. I'm Brian Becker. We're talking with Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst, here in our studio in Washington, D.C., and from New York with Ted Rall, editorial cartoonist and columnist, about the press conference held yesterday by Donald Trump as he prepares to ascend to the White House, and about the unverified reports reported first in CNN and then fully by BuzzFeed and by other media about Donald Trump and where those reports came from. That was a big issue at the press conference. And we are in a tumultuous period, a period of struggle, of strife at the very summits of the U.S. political establishment here in Washington, D.C. Ray McGovern, before we went to break, I was asking you about the motive behind why the allegations are coming that Trump is Vladimir Putin's puppet, that the Russians interfered with the election, why they favored Donald Trump, all of those kind of things. But I also want to talk about the way the CIA and the NSA are responding to the report, to the allegations by you and by other people, including our people here at Loud and Clear, that the evidence that they're offering is called overwhelming circumstantial evidence rather than hard facts. And they keep saying back, well, we can't really reveal the entire report because we don't want to compromise our sources and our methods, because that will let the enemy, the adversary, know exactly how we are ingeniously deriving and ascertaining this information. So this desire, this stated desire or need, compelling need to not reveal sources and methods becomes the go-to explanation. Talk about that, because you were a former CIA analyst.
I was, and it has some really interesting case studies to adduce here to show that this is, well, in the Bronx we would call it a crock. Now, Bill Binney, who used to be technical director for NSA, has, from a technical point of view, Since NSA intercepts and knows the originator and the recipient of each and every email, I know it boggles the mind, but that's what the case is, and that since Ed Snowden gave us slides showing us exactly how NSA accomplishes this with trace mechanisms here and there, that it's virtually impossible that this could have been hacked by Russians and given to Julian Assange without NSA knowing it. Now, interestingly enough, in that sophomoric report that was put out by James Clapper, the head of national intelligence, the CIA and the FBI are totally confident, supreme, high confidence that the Russians did all this. And NSA, which would have the evidence, since NSA works with signal intelligence and intercepted messages, they only have moderate confidence. Now, in the Army, we used to call that a swag factor. That means it's a scientific wild guess, okay? So what are they saying? Well, we can't tell you the real evidence because of sources and methods. That's a canard. Let me give you an example. In 1986, there was a discotheque in Berlin, La Belle Disco, that was blown up. We know it was blown up by Libyan terrorists, okay? How do we know? We had an intercepted message. It was conclusive. We knew, okay? One of those rare occasions where we knew, and so Ronald Reagan sent our aircraft from London and bombed the hell out of Gaddafi's palace, killing one of his daughters, okay? Now, there was an outrage in the world. I said, well, how do you know the Libyans? I think this is just vindictive. I don't know. And so Reagan came to us, and he says, all right, let me see that message. So we showed him the message. It said, success, we made it at 2 o'clock. It went off, okay? So he says, good, we have to give this to the press. And, of course, we said, no, Mr. President, please, you don't understand. The Libyans don't know we're intercepting a message. And this is encrypted. They don't know that we can decode the. No, you can't do that. We'll lose our source. And the president said, did you hear what I said? We gave it to the press. The furor died down. And the President of the United States came out smelling like a rose. Now, what I'm saying here is that there are more important things from a national foreign policy point of view than protecting this or that source, no matter how sexy it might be. My guess is that we had other ways of finding out what the Libyans were doing. In this case, there's absolutely no reason to disguise these things. Why? Because John McCain and the others are saying it's an act of war, for God's sake. Okay, if it's an act of war, show us the beef. Show us the evidence. Disclose a source if you have one. I'm 80% sure that there is no unimpeachable source. I'm a little troubled that NSA now has had time to manufacture such sources as was done to justify, in quotes, the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah, an act of war like, say, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, we kind of know what that was. You didn't have to go into it. This idea that it's an act of war, but nobody can actually give you any specific hard evidence, or what they might call a bombshell revelation when they had the Senate hearings, those joke of a hearings. Ted Rawl, Glenn Greenwald wrote an article for The Intercept entitled, "The Deep State Goes to War with President-Elect Using Unverified Claims While Democrats Cheer." Now, that's all about the incidents of the last few days, the things that we've been talking about. In that article, he writes, and I'm going to read it to you and ask you to respond, see if you agree with Glenn Greenwald on this. It is not hard to understand why the CIA preferred Clinton over Trump. Clinton was critical of Obama for restraining the CIA's proxy war in Syria and was eager to expand that war while Trump denounced it. Clinton clearly wanted a harder line than Obama took against the CIA's long-standing foes in Moscow, while Trump wanted improved relations and greater cooperation. In general, Clinton defended and intended to extend the decades-long international military order on which the CIA and Pentagon's preeminence depends, while Trump, through a still uncertain mix of instability and extremist conviction, poses a threat to it. let's unpack some of this. Could it actually be that the CIA, for those kind of reasons, could be behind the effort to get rid of Trump? And I want to say something else before you answer that. There's a lot of reasons to be against Donald Trump. I mean, people who are opposed to racism or deporting millions of undocumented workers, or opposed to misogyny and sexism, opposed to banning Muslims, opposed to torture. I mean, there's lots of reasons to be opposed to Donald Trump. But, of course, that's not what Glenn Greenwald is saying is the reason that the CIA may be against Trump. Ted Rall, do you agree with Glenn Greenwald?
I don't think the CIA loses a lot of sleep over Black Lives Matter. Let's put it that way. Yeah, this is about power and control, and it's about self-preservation in the case of this particular agency. It is, I mean, look, it as you say, there's lots of perfectly good reasons to oppose Donald Trump. But nevertheless, anybody should be disturbed by the idea that the intelligence community, that the intelligence agencies have the ability to possibly bring down I was going to say a sitting, but soon to be sitting president. I was recently watching Chuck Schumer being interviewed, and he was one of several Democratic leaders, high-ranking Democratic elected officials who outwardly threatened Donald Trump and said, you know, the intelligence community has ways of getting back at people who insulted. It's not what Trump is doing is not a good idea. He might not only might not get their cooperation, but they might get even with him. And I thought, this is the United States of America. Are they seriously saying on national television that an intelligence agency has the right to threaten the president of the United States? You know, whatever happened to civilian control of government? And that's where we are now. I mean, if this is in fact the case, I mean, look, at bare minimum, even if you are completely credulous about these reports and you're a Hillary Clinton Democrat, and and you're from that wing of the Democratic Party, then you believe in these hacks, and you just want Trump to be brought down, you still have to ask yourself, is this the way you want to bring down Donald Trump? You know, do you want to get him based on these reports? It's kind of like getting Al Capone for tax evasion or something. You know, it just doesn't seem like from a policy and morality and political point of view, a place to build the future of a resurgent post-Donald Trump Democratic Party, to try to say basically, hey, let's launch a soft coup against an incoming president. The whole thing is bizarre. And by the way, just wanted to add a little bit to what you were talking about before about this ridiculous conceit that we're hearing that, you know, they have the evidence, but they can't tell us because of the methods that they used to get the evidence. Probably the most famous example in American history where there was an exception made was in the Cuban Missile Crisis, when there was some reluctance to reveal the technology used to take the satellite photos and spy plane photos that showed the Soviet missiles in Cuba. And President Kennedy went on national television against the advice of many of his military advisors and showed the American people the photograph, the satellite and spy plane imagery, the U-2 imagery that proved that those missiles were in Cuba, because he needed that political backing from the American people. So as we've been talking about, it obviously, sources can be revealed if the president wants it to be. So generally speaking, to me, when someone says I can't reveal the sources, but I know something, I tend to call BS. But, you know, maybe it's possible. It might be true that Donald Trump has very interesting sexual proclivities, but right now it doesn't pass the smell test to me.
Ray McGovern, the Russian government reacted pretty quickly and said this is a fabrication, that they don't have a dossier on Trump, that they don't have a dossier on Hillary Clinton. In other words, they went right into it, and they said, the Russian foreign ministry spokesperson, not the foreign ministry spokesperson, but one of the...
Peskov. Mm-hmm.
Yep. He said, this is just an effort to sabotage any improvement in bilateral relations between the U.S. and Russia. I mean, I can understand why Russia would see it exactly like that, because this is so weird.
And because it's true. I mean, you don't have to be a crackerjack analyst to see that Peskov is correct here, for God's sake. You know, it's a perfect storm. You have not only the Democrats who are still reeling. I think the Democrats have PTSD after the battle that they lost in early November. They're still living in shock, and they're willing to believe anything against that dastardly fellow who beat them, namely Trump. Now, I hold no brief for Trump. I voted for Jill Stein. I endorsed her. She knows, and most people know that I thought there was no lesser evil this time, okay? But we have Trump fully elected here, and what we've got is not only the Republicans and Democrats, but we have the media, and this is key. I've seen the media misbehave before. They misbehaved before Iraq. It was flat fact that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And now it's flat fact that Julian Assange was given these very devastating emails by Russia. Now, let me just, as an aside say, those emails were really interesting because they showed that Hillary Clinton stole the nomination from Bernie Sanders. That's the content. All this is a magnificent, and a very successful, with the help of the media, distraction, okay? So what we have here is lots of people coalescing to show that Trump is, a puppet of Putin, and he's actually now he's a sexual deviant, and I've seen it like this before. And you have the same people, and this is interesting, the same people who before Iraq treated weapons of mass destruction as flat fact, saying the same thing about the Russian role here. Now, I refer specifically David Sanger. Now, I had a chance to confront him up in New York last Thursday evening. And I said, David Sanger, right before Iraq, on the 29th of July, just 10 days after George Tenet, the head of the CIA, had told his British counterpart there aren't any weapons of mass destruction, we're fixing the intelligence around the policy. Okay?
That's July 2002.
That's right, 2002. Okay. Right after that, you wrote an article which said 7 times that there were factually proven weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And now you're doing the same thing. Where do you get off treating as flat fact the fact that George Tenet whispers this in your ear? My God! So it is the same people.
What did he say?
Well, he talked. There was a. I have a habit of asking questions from the audience. I was not allowed on the panel, so he talked around it. And I asked him one other question. I said, there is a former ambassador in Her Majesty's Foreign Office, Craig Murray, who said at the beginning of all this fracas that he knew who the source was and he had met with someone connected with the source. Now, did your New York Times people pursue that? No, I know you didn't, because I asked Craig, why were you not interested in a possible alternative explanation to hacking? Well, no, you know what? Nobody from this side of the ocean contacted Ambassador Murray, even though he claimed to have met with someone who was related to the source. So the last thing I'll say here on this little round here is that I'm really glad that Ted raised this business about what Chuck Schumer, senator from New York, told Rachel Maddow on the 3rd of January. He said, this is really dumb on the part of Trump. I mean, the CIA has, quote, 4 ways to Sunday to get back at people like that. A smart businessman wouldn't have taken that chance. Well, wow. I mean, hello? Do presidents or presidents-elect really have to be that afraid of the CIA? I suppose Chuck Schumer thinks that is the case.
That's Ray McGovern. We're talking to Ray and Ted Rall for the first full hour about the first press conference of Donald Trump and the amazing, sensational headlines about an unverified intelligence report that the intelligence organizations like the CIA said were credible, that were then released or leaked to the media. CNN, BuzzFeed, became a big deal. It has a big impact as Donald Trump plans to ascend to the White House. You are listening to Loud and Clear. We'll be back.
Loud and Clear. Loud and Clear.
You are listening to Loud and Clear. I'm Brian Becker. We're talking with Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst, now a journalist and political activist, and Ted Rall, editorial cartoonist and columnist, about Donald Trump's first press conference and the sensational headlines about the release to the media and the publication by some media of unverified reports that Russia and Russian intelligence had compromising information on Donald Trump. Ted Rall, let's go back to you. I want to talk about BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed published this dossier. It doesn't have any name attached to it. They keep saying it's a former British intelligence agent. In other words, a single person who had been hired earlier by anti-Trump Republicans and then anti-Trump Democrats to, compile dirt on Donald Trump. Now, the CNN published a report that the CIA and other intelligence institutions that had briefed Obama and Donald Trump had the report, read the report, a 2-page annex to both Obama and Trump because they considered it credible. And then suddenly, even though those were classified discussions, it was in the media and CNN had information about it. And then BuzzFeed published it. And BuzzFeed's editor-in-chief went on to say this about the decision to publish this unverified information. Our presumption is to be transparent in our journalism and to share what we have with our readers. We have always erred on the side of publishing. In this case, the document was in wide circulation at the highest levels of American government and media. Publishing the document was not an easy or simple call, and people of goodwill may disagree with our choice, but publishing this dossier reflects how we see the job of reporters in 2017. Now, this report was circulating not only with the media in the last couple of days, but apparently the Hillary Clinton campaign knew about it. And Hillary Clinton campaign former spokesman Brian Fallon reacted to the BuzzFeed leak by saying, "Today has brought a gush of reporting that outlets knew about and sat on prior to November 8th. I repeat, certain media outlets were told this prior to November 8th. I mean, the implication here from the Clinton campaign is, okay, this should have happened a long time ago. But of course, these are still, as of yet, unverified reports.
Not just unverified, but there's still some doubt about the authenticity of the report itself. In other words, there's still some doubt being circulated, I think, fairly credibly, and not yet settled as to whether the documents that have appeared on BuzzFeed are actually the same reports that have been circulated on Capitol Hill and elsewhere in Washington at the highest levels. There's some concerns about the formatting, about some of the language that's and some of the jargon that's used that doesn't apparently correspond to similar reports. WikiLeaks has said that there's some concern that they don't seem to be official documents. So it's 2 steps removed. I mean, it's really 3 steps of BS if you really look at it. I mean,
BS is bad sociology, right?
That's right.
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
right.
yeah.
I mean, so you've got so on the one hand, there's the question, are the documents themselves authentic? In other words, are these the documents that came out of CIA and other agencies? We don't even know that. So then there's the question of, is the content, assuming they're legitimate, is the content well sourced? Well, we don't know that because we don't know what the sources are. And then should the media report on things that are just hearsay without any kind of sourcing? I mean, it is not common journalistic practice, or at least it didn't used to be, to report on rank speculation. Apparently, it's a whole different world. I mean, now I think I was talking to some colleagues about this, right after this all broke yesterday, and one of the things that we were blaming this on is really, it's bad. It's how newspapers and other media organizations have been gutted by budget cuts over the past few decades, and a lot of the sort of the people who passed around the old chestnut, if your mother says she loves you, check it out with two sources. Those people are gone, right? So we've lost the old timers who were cynical, and we have a lot of younger, underpaid reporters who've replaced them, who aren't really aware of the old standards of journalism, and then kind of the Gen Xers who kind of are the sweet spot of having enough knowledge of journalism to know what's what, and also understand the technology to know that it's really easy to fake a document. They all got laid off first. So it's an ugly scene. And this is not a shining moment for the Fourth Estate, even if all of this turned out to be 100% true, which I would be shocked by. It has not been properly reported or sourced.
Ray McGovern, a sad day for journalism. Well, Donald Trump said that CNN was just fake news. He's obviously upset and angry about this. He refused, in fact, to allow the CNN reporter to ask him a question. In one way, though, the U.S. has always engaged in fake news. I mean, we had the Gulf of Tonkin, which was fake. That's what led or was used as a pretext to send 58,000 Americans to their death in Vietnam, and who knows, maybe 1 million or 2 million Vietnamese. We've had lots of fake news. We had fake news in Iraq about weapons of mass destruction, fake news in Libya that there was about to be a genocide against civilians and the U.S. had to go in with NATO. I mean, fake news is part of war propaganda, and the old cliche, the first casualty in war is the truth, is a cliche, but it's also true. And it's also true about the run-ups to war. And I want to ask you, I want you to keep going with, I know you have other things that you want to talk about, but talk about that, because is the Hillary Clinton campaign, are the CIA, is the NSA, is the Pentagon, are they actually looking for, are they incentivized to have more and more confrontation, that maybe not a full-scale war, but these are the ways that wars start?
Well, this is a really key question. The role of the CIA and the media. Now, Bill Colby was quoted as saying, "We, the CIA, control about 90% of all the important people in the media." Now, there's some question as to whether he said exactly that.
He was the CIA director.
He was in the 70s, and I worked directly under him. He was the director with the most integrity for whom I worked, and I worked for several of them at one remove. Now, that may be hyperbole, but Bill Casey said, and I know the person who was in the room when he said this, when we have completely succeeded in deceiving all the American people into thinking what we want them to think, then we will have achieved our mission. Wow. Now, we have the New York Times listening to whispers from John Brennan. We know it's Brennan because the Wall Street Journal has really been very angry at the fact that Brennan's only talking to the New York Times, and they named them, okay? So we have this incredibly interesting situation where, if you look at Iraq, for example, now, the source of this scurrilous stuff is said to be a former MI6 operative in London. Okay, so MI6, that's the equivalent of the CIA. Now, what else has MI6 served up to us? Well, do you remember George Bush saying in one of his State of the Union addresses that we know from British intelligence that Iraq has sought yellow cake uranium in Niger in deepest Africa. Now, that was a crock. That was made up by Dick Cheney and the people who cooperated with him. And I'll never forget, after Colin Powell had made his speech, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, part of the UN, had an interview with their chief verifier. His name was Al-Baradei. And they asked him about this yellow cake uranium letter that was supposed to have shown that these officials in Niger had been asked and had provided yellow cake uranium to Iraq. And he said, we had our specialists look at that. It only took 2 days, but we determined very quickly that these were not authentic. You can still be a diplomat and you can say this is a crock, right? So that was a forgery. Now, the UK can always come through, and MI6, especially MI5, the opposite number of the FBI, is also really good at this. So these are completely not authentic. And to have the British doing this at one, it's just so reminiscent of the fact that, I've seen this movie before. And, of course, just to finish up on the yellow cake, we knew that there were tons and tons and tons of yellow cake uranium already in Iraq. They didn't need any more from Africa. It was a question of having to refine it to a higher level of refinement. So the whole thing was from the get-go. And finally, Colin Powell said, well, all right, actually, that's why I didn't use it in my speech to the UN. It's the only crock that he didn't use, but he, too, knew that it was not authentic.
Not authentic, also known as a lie. Just a bold-faced lie.
We don't say that in Washington. We say prevarication or other big words like that.
Right.
Lie is not allowed.
Lie is not part of the vocabulary. Ted Rall asked about his message to Vladimir Putin at the press conference yesterday. Donald Trump said, this is in the midst of this big scandal where, again, CNN and BuzzFeed and the CIA are basically saying Donald Trump has been sort of a pawn of Russia because Russia has compromising information about Donald Trump's activities when he was staying at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Moscow a few years ago. Trump said this about, they were asking, well, do you believe the Russians are hacking? And he said, he shouldn't have done it, meaning hacking. He shouldn't be doing it. Now he's talking about Vladimir Putin. Russia should have much greater respect for our country. When I am leading it, they will have greater respect. I hope, meaning the United States and Russia, get along, but if we don't, that's possible too. Now, Trump has been bashing China, during the campaign and since he was elected, but he's resisted the efforts, the demands by others to bash Russia. And he's kept saying when the U.S., you were saying earlier, when the intelligence organizations were saying that Russia hacked the election and favored the outcome of Trump, at that time Trump said, oh, these are the people who brought us the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. In other words, he ridiculed the CIA for saying such a thing. But now here he is at the press conference. He's angry about the press reports. He's angry about the situation. But he's also saying, yes, Russia hacked. He shouldn't have done it. We might not even have good relations with Russia when I'm president. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. In other words, there's an evolution now happening in Trump's, at least public formulations about the intelligence organizations, the reports on Russian hacking, and about U.S.-Russian relations itself. In other words, is the effort ultimately to turn Trump away from the normalizing of relations with Russia?
I've been hesitant to say this definitely happened, that definitely did not happen. But in this particular case, Brian, there is absolutely no question. The media establishment, the Democratic Party, many Republicans as well at the highest levels are all on the same page. They definitely oppose all the signals of warming relations that Donald Trump is sending between Russia and the United States, and they oppose that vehemently. There is no question about it. And Trump might be a stubborn dude, but he's feeling the heat. Imagine it from his point of view, where he wakes up every day to be accused of essentially being a Russian agent or a Russian dupe. He's been accused of treason. He's being accused of sexual perversion and of being essentially having fallen for a classic Cold War style honeypot operation. So, yeah, he's feeling the heat. He knows that he's going to pay a price among certain quarters, very influential quarters, particularly the media, for any kind of warming relations with Russia. He knows it. Yeah, the establishment does not want that to happen, and they are pulling out all the stops to prevent it.
Ray McGovern, there's talk about the deep state. I call it just the state because I think that's what it is. But in other words, it's the professional government. The politicians come and go, but the professional establishment, the professionals, not the civil servant types, but the people who are really leading these different institutions and agencies, they do remain. And there is a Washington consensus, and it's hostile, antithetical, adversarial with Russia. Now, the Soviet Union is no more. No one can really say Vladimir Putin is trying to promote worldwide socialist revolution, which is what the United States might have said about Soviet-era leaders, at least starting in 1917, 1918. I want to have you help us understand what's the reason for the enduring enmity between the U.S. establishment, the deep state or the state, and Russia under these circumstances. And again, now Rex Tillerson, who was being sort of pilloried by the Democrats because he was supposedly a friend, too, of Putin, just like Trump was supposedly a friend. When he appeared before the Senate confirmation hearings, he said, we must be clear-eyed about our relationship with Russia. Russia today poses a danger, but it is not unpredictable in advancing its own interests. It has invaded Ukraine, including taking of Crimea, supported Syrian forces that brutally violated the laws of war. Our NATO allies are right to be alarmed at resurgent Russia. Again, it seems like the incoming Trump government is being moved into, under all of these pressures, an anti-Russian position. Why? Help the audience explain if that's true, if you agree with that, and also what accounts for the enduring enmity 25 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union between the U.S. and now the new Russia.
Well, the same reason why we went in big time in helping that fellow Yeltsin to run Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. It has to do with, well, let's call it the military, industrial, congressional, deep state intelligence complex. Now, DOD, Department of Defense, the CIA especially, the CIA has grown in funding, most people say 3 times. It's at least 2 times since 9/11. As long as you have enemies going, you've got a really flourishing industry. You got a really good deal going. You know, I like to refer to what Pope Francis said before Congress in September of the year before last. He said, you know, the real problem is the blood-soaked arms traders. Whoa. Well, all the senators and representatives, they got up and they clapped and they looked in their vest pocket to see if the latest envelope from Lockheed or Raytheon was still there. That's the problem. Peace is really not very good for business or for security agencies or intelligence agencies or DOD or Lockheed or Raytheon. Tension? If you have an enemy, like a formidable enemy, if you could make Russia an enemy, 4. Sure, go ahead. The thing about the Ukraine and Crimea, I would just emphasize that there was not one, and there still remains, not one scintilla of evidence that Putin or any of his advisors decided to take Crimea back before we mounted a coup on Russia's doorstep in Kiev on the 22nd of February 2014. That was the most blatant coup in the history of mankind, according to George Friedman, head of Stratfor. Why? Because it was advertised 2 weeks before on YouTube, with our Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, talking to our ambassador in Kiev, saying, Yats is the guy, we got it all glued, just hang on. Yatsenyuk became the prime minister.
That's going to be the last word. Ray McGovern, you are right. The CIA and others are afraid there could be an outbreak of peace. We've been talking with Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst, and Ted Rall about Donald Trump's press conference yesterday and U.S.-Russian relations. We'll be back tomorrow. Be sure to go to our Facebook page, Loud and Clear with Brian Becker, for daily updates. If you enjoy the show and want your friends to hear it, let us know by liking the page on Facebook. Remember, telling the truth is important, but to make a difference, it has to be loud and clear. We are out of here.
Loud and Clear.